Here is an individual running this company
that just have so much global power.
Mark Zuckerberg has unilateral control over the company.
He's uncompromising, ruthless.
Journalists were farmers. Meta would steal their crops.
Leach your product, not pay you for that product.
And expect to be thanked for the privilege.
We're dealing with a foreign entity that we have no control over.
Misinformation, cyberbullying, fake news.
Raw, horrific footage from terrorist organisations.
We suffer every minute of every day after the loss of our son.
Is Zuckerberg a digital dictator? Yes.
They're bullying the Australian government.
You may use Facebook, but make no mistake, Facebook's using you.
This is a story about how a $2 trillion US giant is bullying Australia, ripping off Aussie companies and deciding what news you're allowed to see on social media.
Facebook don't negotiate, they dictate.
It was late on a Thursday night when News Corp Australia boss Michael Miller learned he'd been summoned to a conference call at 9 a.m. the next morning with Facebook executives.
The meeting lasted 9 minutes, and they told us we would not negotiate with you. It wasn't a shock. We'd seen what they'd done around the world. Meta have a history of abusing their market power.
In 2021, Facebook, or Meta as its parent company is now known, agreed to pay around $70 million annually in royalties for the Australian news content featured on its platforms. News content which helped Facebook to attract endless clicks and advertising dollars away from the media companies and those who'd researched, written, filmed and created that content. The Australian agreement, brokered by the then coalition government, is known as the News Bargaining Code, and it was a world first.
This was always a proxy battle here in Australia for the rest of the world. What was at stake here was Australia's sovereignty, our ability to make laws that affected those companies that operated within our borders.
Then Treasurer Josh Frydenberg, famously going toe-to-toe with Mark Zuckerberg over webcam. The other tech giant, Google, also agreed to pay for the news content it makes money from. But now Facebook says it won't pay another cent for the Australian news on its platform.
It's an absolute insult.
Australian media bosses are united against Facebook's attack on their companies, on the Australian public and on our government.
It's not just bullying Australian media companies, but it's bullying those people who are creating that important work. It's bullying the Australian public. The idea that, a major international tech company can consider themselves above our laws and regulation, I think, is a bigger issue if we let this pass. This is like having your product taken from you, no compensation for that product, and a third party generating revenues and not acknowledging the product that they've taken.
It's not just the big newspapers and networks. The Warragul Druin Gazette, east of Melbourne, has been printing papers for 125 years. The Facebook agreement had allowed it to cover more news. It's now looking to cut costs, meaning fewer stories about local issues.
What will happen is news services will no doubt be reduced. I mean, it's just a matter of economics. We may not be able to get out and cover stories in those outer reaches of our circulation area.
There's a small schools sports carnival the other week.
Who took these?
Me.
Without this funding, there is no question that papers will disappear, which is a big pity for the communities they serve.
This will be devastating to Australian news media publishers. It will have a profound impact on the quality of news media in this country.
Michelle Rowland is the Communications Minister and a former telecommunications lawyer. You'd agree it's a middle finger to the Australian media?
That is exactly what it looks like to Australian news media, but it's also the same attitude that's being displayed towards the Australian people.
The Minister too was summoned to a call with Meta bosses but wasn't shocked, calling the decision not unanticipated. Any chance that they're bluffing?
It appears that Meta has made this decision not only for Australia but for the US, and that follows its decision in some other jurisdictions as well.
What started in a bedroom is now a behemoth. It boasts 3 billion active members. Its global revenue last year is reported to have topped $200 billion. Its origins were sleazy, with what's known as Face Smash, a site dedicated to rating the looks of young women on his Harvard campus whose data had been hacked.
Face Smash was a prank website that I launched in college in my dorm room.
It then became the Facebook, linking uni students.
When we first launched, we were hoping for, maybe 400, 500 people. Now we're at 100,000 people, so who knows where we're going next? Maybe we could make something cool.
Zuckerberg was later sued by the Winklevoss brothers, who alleged he stole their idea. The company's motto, a blunt one.
I think it's more useful to make things happen and then apologize later.
It acquired video sharing platform Instagram and messaging service WhatsApp, as Zuckerberg became the youngest self-made billionaire in history. In 2016, a company called Cambridge Analytica used the personal information of tens of millions of Facebook users to target voters in the US presidential election. It exposed how easily unsuspecting users could be traced, tracked, and targeted.
It's a giant fine for the giant of social media.
A $5 billion civil penalty.
This was a major breach of trust, and I'm really sorry that this happened.
In January, Mark Zuckerberg was grilled by US senators.
37% of teenage girls between 13 and 15 were exposed to unwanted nudity in a week on Instagram. You knew about it. Who did you fire?
Senator, this is why we're building all
Who did you fire?
Tools. Senator, I don't think that's...
Who did you fire?
I'm not going to answer that.
He apologised to families who were there to witness his interrogation.
Show them the pictures. Would you like to apologize for what you've done to these good people?
I'm sorry for everything that you've all been through. No one should have to go through the things that your families have suffered.
David was a great kid and he had friends. He was addicted to his screen and to social media, to Instagram.
Maureen Molak understands all too well how Meta's platforms, which include Instagram as well as Facebook, can be used for evil.
I wake up every single day in a state of dismay. Like, how did I end up here? We suffer every single minute of every day after the loss of our son, David, 8 years ago, to suicide after he was the target of relentless and devastating cyberbullying that left him feeling helpless and hopeless.
The fatal bullying of David Molak would never have been possible if it wasn't for the digital smokescreen Meta allowed cowards to hide behind as they tormented him to his grave.
It occurred on Instagram. It started with some posts from some boys who were jealous of a relationship that David had with a girl. And it was what we call a cyber mob. He was attacked. He was threatened online. They said, put him in a body bag, put him 6 feet under. They told him he should never go back to school. They called him an ape and a psycho. And this was going on through, various posts and comments and shares that was not taken down at the time.
It was January 3, 2016, when the pressure became too much. David took his own life. Mother Maureen discovered his body just days after he finally revealed to his family the campaign of bullying that pushed him over the edge. He was 16 years old.
David was afraid we were going to take his phone away from him, and so he didn't tell us until it got so bad. And the worst part of it is that through the algorithm of the platform, it was shared across hundreds and thousands of people saw it. And so there were people that were chiming in on it and maybe a comment with a LOL or some other kind of a comment, people that he didn't even know. And I mean, there were hundreds of comments.
Maureen is among the parents taking on Meta and its billionaire boss.
This is a David and Goliath story. I mean, we are parent survivors who take off from work. We do not have the money that Meta has. And we are up at the United States Capitol often, paying out of our own pocket to try to get there and talk to our legislators about the need for online child safety. And Meta continues to backdoor it and send their army of lobbyists to fight us tooth and nail every step of the way.
Facebook has studied a pattern that they call problematic use, what we might more commonly call addiction.
Frances Haugen has been inside the beast, working as a data scientist at Facebook before turning whistleblower in 2021, revealing the company's dirty secrets.
Recently, 44 states sued Meta for lying to the public about public safety, like knowingly harming children and then telling the public, oh, nothing's wrong, which is exactly the same playbook that Big Tobacco played in the United States for decades. In the filings, they had excerpts from conversations by Meta's own employees where they said to each other, we are the tobacco companies.
Frances believes Meta will dig its heels in, and rather than pay good money for news content produced by other companies, will instead ban Australian news from your Facebook feed altogether. It's already done just that in Canada after they followed our lead and passed a tough media bargaining code.
And what Meta is saying right now is they're unwilling to even have a conversation. You know, they're just going to opt out. They're just going to remove the news.
This has left a void on these two big platforms, on Facebook and on Instagram.
Alfred Hamida is a journalist and professor in Canada.
For nearly 9 months now, Canadians have had no news from news organizations, be they large media or local startups on Facebook or Instagram.
He sees a problem with viewers who've been groomed to glance across Facebook for their news, only to now receive unregulated content that could be inaccurate or just made up.
Potentially, you could also see with elections coming up in the US and other countries, they would be facing a huge challenge in terms of misinformation and potentially AI-generated misinformation.
Meta has turned off news in Australia before, for 8 days back in 2021.
Breaking news now, developing story this morning. Facebook has stopped its Australian users from accessing news sites.
In the process, it also cut off Australian emergency organisations and charities, causing a huge backlash and forcing them to turn news back on.
Facebook has refriended Australia, and Australian news will be restored to the Facebook platform.
From 2013 to 17, Stephen Sheila ran Facebook in Australia and New Zealand for Mark Zuckerberg. Like Francis, his instincts tell him Facebook is on the brink of blocking news.
From what I've seen, what's happened in Canada, some other markets, from what I've heard, I think they have decided that news is not an important part of the future of Meta and social media. There's a line where you need to pay for it. Facebook's saying, well, we'll go on the other side of that line so that we don't have to pay for it. They've come to a decision that this just is too much trouble. Let's turn this off.
If they turn off news, that's probably the worst outcome for Australia. Means less stories, particularly local stories, less promotion of local businesses, less scrutiny of local councils, less community information at a hyper-local level.
That's a real concern, I think, for Australia and Australian society.
Former head of the ACCC, Rod Sims, agrees it was his investigation 4 years ago that led to the media bargaining code.
Media is the fourth estate. To have large platforms deciding they won't show news, I think is something the government needs to think about whether they'll find acceptable or not.
These big tech giants are almost like nation states in themselves. They have that kind of power. And it's very hard for somewhere like Canada, potentially for somewhere like Australia, to really force these platforms to do what is best for society, which would be carry news on their platforms.
You've testified that Facebook puts, in your words, astronomical profits ahead of people. Do you still stand by that?
Let's do for easy math, 20 million Australian users. Let's say every year they make at least $150. It's probably more. That adds up to billions and billions and billions of dollars in revenue just off of Australians.
Their last accounts in Australia, they reported approximately $1.2 billion of revenue. The ACCC, in its report, estimated it to be between $4.2 and $5.3 billion.
And despite that enormous revenue, Meta works hard to make sure it pays minimal tax here. In fact, in 2021, it paid $24 million tax in Australia. The year before, even less, as it sends hundreds of millions of dollars back to its parent company overseas. Leaked information shows its deals to pay local media companies for news content was set up not with Facebook in Sydney, but with Facebook in Ireland, where their corporate tax rate is less than half of ours.
They operate at enormous scale, and therefore the ability to be able to reasonably negotiate with them commercially is very difficult in a relatively small market like Australia versus the rest of the world.
And they point blank refused to negotiate, contrary to the laws of the Australian Parliament.
Is Mark Zuckerberg a digital dictator?
In our experience the past week, yes. He said that there are no terms, there is no negotiation, and will continue to take your content.
It's not an overstatement to say that he's a digital dictator. He has the majority of shares of control in his company. No one can remove him except for basically his own bad behavior. He became the CEO of Facebook when he was 19 years old. He has been surrounded by people who just tell him what he wants to hear ever since. You know, he's about to turn 40. That's half his life he's spent in an echo chamber.
Even though he's a very smart individual, I'm concerned that he's living in a bit of a bubble in terms of his understanding of the impact the platform has. And maybe that bubble is self-imposed as well. He doesn't want to know or doesn't care. There's an old saying that, in Stalinist Russia, that one death is a tragedy, but 1 million deaths is a statistic, right? And I think Mark is sort of in that same realm now. That desire to build a company that has an outsized impact in the history of the world, I think that is Mark through and through.
If you could give Mark Zuckerberg the choice between unlimited money or unlimited influence, what do you think he'd choose?
I think he'd choose influence every day.
We want everyone who uses our services to have safe and positive experiences. I want to recognize the families who are here today who have lost a loved one or lived through some terrible things that no family should have to endure. These issues are important for every parent and every platform. I'm committed to continuing to work in these areas, and I hope we can make progress today.
Mr. Zuckerberg, you have blood on your hands. You have a product that's killing people.
Walker Montgomery was 16 when he took his own life. He fell victim to a Nigerian scammer who found him on Meta's Instagram.
Walker had no mental illness. He had none of those tendencies. He had a great social life. There was a threat in his room that night. December the 1st, 2022, a threat came across the internet and was in his bedroom. Could have just as easily shot Walker in the head in my own home. That threat was there. Does Mark Zuckerberg have responsibility? Absolutely. He had information. He knew what the opportunities were for these predators to seek out my son in the middle of the night.
A man posing as a girl Walker's age convinced him to send intimate images and then threatened to share them with his family unless he paid the scammer $1,000. Walker begged the faceless coward not to share the images.
When Walker told him, "I'm going to kill myself," that man, that person said, "Go ahead, because you're already dead anyway." We all agree that a Nigerian man shouldn't be able to contact my son, my 16-year-old son, pretend to be a young girl, convince him to have a sexual encounter, and then bribe him with that content over the internet.
All up, from the moment Walker received the first message to his death, took 4 hours.
What we know now is that Meta, Zuckerberg, and Instagram and Facebook very obviously knew the dangers. And I go back to our particular case. The danger that was introduced to Walker was allowing somebody to have access to him that was a criminal, was a predator.
It's the tragic stories of young people tormented to death on social media that concerns many here in Australia. Meta's social media platforms, Facebook and Instagram, provide the perfect environment for sinister players to thrive and real harm to be done by the sort of people Australian journalists work every day to expose and hold to account.
if you're running a major platform, be it Facebook or Instagram, and you've decided you're not going to show any news from the trusted established news sources, that means you're going to have a lot more untrustworthy news, you're going to have a lot more extreme news.
And it's not just individuals who are poised to exploit that void.
I'm very concerned that putting quality news and information off these platforms will just create more space for the Chinese Communist Party, the Russian government, the Iranian government and others to use these platforms to undermine our country.
The Shadow Cybersecurity Minister, Senator James Paterson, is worried about how safety and security if legitimate sources of news and information are suppressed by Facebook.
It is going to lead to people being radicalised. At the very least, that's going to undermine our social cohesion and our unity as a nation.
And it's what's replacing accredited media that has experts worried.
We saw that news influencers ended up taking over the space that formal news organizations had before,
creating a potential home for Islamic extremism, far-right sentiment, and the deepest of political divisions, the likes of which saw protesters storm America's capital. Meta declined our repeated offers for an interview. On the morning of their shock announcement, the company said it was, quote, deprecating Facebook News. That's IT jargon for removing a program or application no longer supported, in this case, trusted sources of news. Claiming that people don't come to Facebook for news and political content, they come to connect with people and discover new opportunities, passions and interests. In the shadow of Meta's Australian headquarters in Sydney, Facebook's decision to stop paying for news does not sit well with some of its 22 million Australian users.
I personally don't think it's a good decision to make.
It's absolutely unfair.
It's definitely fair to pay news outlets for the work that they put forward.
There is also some concern that the other tech giant, Google, which also owns YouTube, may follow Facebook's lead. Its contracts with our news organisations are even bigger than Meta's.
Google is watching this closely, and whilst we haven't seen to the extent that kind of behaviour of Meta, one has to obviously assume that Google is looking at this and will be very much, I wouldn't say about to walk, but I would acknowledge that Google has been engaged.
Google told us that many of their deals with news organisations are locked in for longer than Meta's, but that they were negotiating with companies whose contracts are close to expiry. The man who forced Facebook and Google to pay for other companies' news, former Treasurer Josh Frydenberg, says a solution can be found.
The payday we achieved for Australian journalism with the help of the ACCC was a world first. The legislation that we put in place and the commercial agreements that were struck between the parties is both a blueprint and a precedent for others to follow.
In effect, the News Media Bargaining Code attempts to level the commercial playing field between Australian media companies and the tech titans, Facebook and Google, making money out of those companies.
This is really about an imbalance of bargaining power.
Professor Andrew Christie is one of the government's Mr. Fix-Its under the code. He's on a panel of experts entrusted to sort out disputes between social media giants and journalism companies.
It's a little bit like a parent saying to squabbling children, sort it out for yourselves. If you can't sort it out, I'll sort it out for you. There was an implied threat to the digital platforms that if they don't reach agreement with the media businesses of their own accord, then the government would designate them and put them into the code, which has the potential to start a staged process.
Negotiation, mediation, arbitration, a triple threat in the legislation that had worked. The mere prospect of being what's known as designated to be dragged before a bargaining table with media companies had forced Meta to behave, but not anymore.
We absolutely encourage the government to use all the powers that are available to them to ensure that we get the fair negotiation that we should have.
Are you ready to designate Meta and bring them under the Media Bargaining Code?
We will follow the process as set out in the legislation in terms of the steps required in order to designate, because we are also very mindful of the deep pockets that this organisation has.
Aussies won't have to work anymore. Elon Musk...
It's not just about jobs. Already, high-profile Australian journalists and media identities have found themselves victim of hurtful and personal attacks on their reputations.
I have actually been cryogenically frozen since the late 1990s. That's why I don't have wrinkles.
And it's starting to look more and more realistic. Videos that look absolutely like the person is really talking to you. And as you turn down real news, well, that void is probably going to get filled by this sort of fake news, AI-generated news, and that is probably not a good place for democracy to be.
Has the government dropped the ball here in any regards? Have they picked up the phone to the boss, to Mark Zuckerberg, and had a conversation with him that you're aware of?
I'm not aware of that.
Really? And would you urge them to, or are you surprised that they haven't?
I know the Australian government have a process to go through. Ministers Jones and Rowland have been moving quickly, and I appreciate that. I feel the Australian government has struggled as we have to get through.
Has anyone from your government phoned Mark Zuckerberg?
We have been engaging with Meta throughout this process as well.
But has anyone phoned Mark Zuckerberg?
At all times, we will be following the code process closely. We have been engaging
but not with
Meta
Mark Zuckerberg,
throughout this process.
as the last government did.
We have been engaging with Meta throughout this process. From Treasury...
Sorry to cut you off, but you admit this is bad for jobs, you admit this is bad for the country, it's bad for democracy, it's bad for everyone. Why can't you get on the phone to him?
We will do everything that is necessary to bring this to a conclusion.
Decisions of this magnitude come down from the top. This is not just about Australia, it's about what happens in the world.
Oh, hey, Mark. Hey, what's going on?
Hi, Mark. What's up, Mark?
The next platform and medium will be even more immersive. An embodied internet where you're in the experience, not just looking at it. And we call this the metaverse.
Hey, should we deal you in? But in Mark Zuckerberg's world, it could well be a metaverse without a trusted source of news.
I think the government needs to think very carefully about whether that's how we want major platforms to work in Australia. So I would just urge them to give a lot of thought to what happens next if indeed Facebook do take all the news down.
One idea is to start treating social media companies like Meta and Google as television stations are in Australia, potentially charging licence fees and regulating content.
The other thing to think about is what content they should be obliged to take. That's, I think, the issue I'm more getting at. I think that needs a lot of thought. I'm not so much advocating it as just making sure that it's on the menu of things to think about.
In other words, force the tech giants to carry news as well as pay for it. There is more the government could consider. Sky News has obtained figures showing Labor is the biggest spending political party when it comes to advertising on Meta, spending more than $3 million since March 2020. Should the government consider not advertising any further on Facebook until they come back to the negotiating table?
I respect the views of many people who've put this forward, that Australians and those who advertise within Australia should be considering this.
How do you expect things to play out and how long could it take?
There are a few outcomes. The best outcome would be that Meta comes back to the table. But I do feel that parliamentarians could be doing more to support their local media at a local level and ultimately support the communities that local media represent.
Australia is at a crossroads, a nation with one of the proudest and most vibrant media histories in the world. A media underpinning our great democracy is under attack. From a college dropout turned billionaire. And the reason Aussie media is fighting back so hard, because the stories it tells are your stories.
News organizations aren't just businesses trying to make a dollar. They're serving the public good. They're providing a vital public service.
This is something that is upon us now.
Now's not the time for the Australian government to blink.
That requires us to be responsible, to be calm and clear-headed.
All we need is for the Albanese government to show some strength and stand up for Australia.
They need to act very quickly.
Now's the time to stand up and be heard. The world is watching how Australia deals with this moment.
Our kids are worth more than this.
If we have anything to do with it as parent survivors, it is the day of reckoning is coming for Meta.